So the title is Dechristianizing the Liberation Theology. So in this topic, I would like to address two of the themes of this particular title. One is, why do we need to de-Christianize the liberation theology? And what is the importance of the Asian context? So in which, why do we need really to deconstruct or de-Christianize the liberation theology? For which I would say Jesus was introduced to the Asians as Christ, the divine being, primarily with two frameworks. One is ecclesiological framework, that is theology, in other words, Christology, which was emphasizing on the divine being, the divine nature of Jesus, then the historical realities about the person called Jesus. And the second reality was the colonial framework. I want to include all these, particularly three frameworks: Jewish and Roman and British, especially in Indian context. So all these frameworks wanted to fix Jesus within their the framework of their interest. So Jesus was introduced within these basically frameworks to the Asian countries. So there is a need to deconstruct that Christology which has Christ with these particular frameworks. This Christological deconstruction basically deals with two aspects. The first one is how to deal with the divinity of Jesus. And why do we deal with the divinity of Jesus than Jesus as a historical person? The reason is the context, the multi-religious context of Asia, which already has been experiencing and enriching and enjoying the crores and thousands and crores of gods and goddesses. And Jesus was introduced, when Jesus was introduced as a divine being, the Christ as a divine being, which was not at all a need for the Asian communities. Also, it was very much insignificant. It was looking like very insignificant for the Asian communities. What happened in Asian countries, they took Jesus as one among the thousands of deities in the Asian lands. Even you can see the same thing in today's Indian families, Indian houses, where they keep the photo of Jesus among the hundreds of deities. So the second point is, the liberation theology doesn't need to be a Christian in its nature for the Asian, because already the Asian land has been engaged with the liberation movement of its own self, locally and nationally. The liberation theology was not very new to the Asian context, even before the era of colonial time. Before the colonial era itself, we were having the own local and national level of liberation movements in each and every lands of the Asian continent. And after the colonial era, that era also gave rise to birth to so many extra levels of the next level of liberation movements in the Asian context. So there is a need to deconstruct this Christology, which was given to the Asian countries through the mission movements of the Western missionaries. So proposing liberation theology with particular exclusive religious framework, either it can be Jewish or Christianized, or even the British way of Christianized framework, proposing that liberation theology for the multi-religious and multicultural communities always fails to imagine the core image, the core message of kingdom of God, that is salvation for all, liberation for all. Then you may ask me a question, then how to perceive Jesus or as Christ in what framework? The context of Asian communities tells us that the Christology of community realities are more important than perceiving Jesus as Christ with particular institutional interest. It may be a religion or something else. Jesus was Christianized in the history by the church, especially after the 3rd century in the history. With the Jewish Christianity framework, that Jewish Christianity was having the framework of Hellenized Judaism. So this messianic understanding of Jesus, the Christological understanding of Jesus, was thread woven around the person called Jesus with the elements of Jewish religion, religious interest, also the Hellenistic religious worldview. These are the frameworks, doesn't mean anything to the multi-religious, multi-context of the Asian community. So I would like to propose the term or the concept nirvana is very common in most of the Asian countries. Nirvana means like bare body, a body or a thing or a concept unconditioned by anything. So liberation of a particular community always bounded with its own history, time, and also the particular exclusive need of the community. So the liberation framework of any community in the history always bounded to that particular historical realities, particular historical need or suffering of that particular community. So in order to bring the existing liberative frameworks to the particular community, it won't be a relevant one. So we need to have a core gospel message which is taken to the nirvana context that can be incarnated to the respective communities or the context, the need of the context of the particular communities all over the world. So the nirvana of the gospel, I mean, which is free from any socio-cultural, religious, and gender interest of any society or any agency in the world. So Dechristianizing is a hermeneutical demand by the Asians. It's a hermeneutical engagement in contextualizing the liberation theology for the Asian communities. So it is all about how Christ was perceived by the gospel communities. I mean, the communities of the historical Jesus time, and how Christ was perceived by the post-resurrected communities of Christians. I mean it, Christ of the Ecclesia. Particularly, we see those images of Christ or Christology in the epistles of the New Testament. So perceiving Jesus as liberator by the community of Jesus' time didn't demand them to have the faith in resurrection. They could accept Jesus as Christ or Messiah without the aspect of crucifixion or resurrection, which are taken very serious with the ecclesial theology to bring about the Christology about Jesus in the later centuries. So Christology was need of the developed church, the development of the theology of the early church, or the developed early church, especially after the 2nd century. So the communities, the context of the communities becomes very important in order to dechristianize the liberation theology for the Asian context particularly. Perceiving Jesus as a liberator by the historical time of Jesus, the community of the historical time of Jesus, people, especially the marginalized communities who were experiencing the messianic emancipation or messianic manifestation of Jesus through healing or teaching or revealing their own struggles, those communities were not in need to concern about the Christological frameworks of Jesus' messianic identity itself. For them, the survival was the primary interest in perceiving Jesus as Christ. For example, how Canaanite woman was pronouncing Jesus as son of David, which was not at her interest of her liberative framework. So not the Christology, but the realities of the communities, the suffering communities, become the subject when we contextually or methodologically consider the Christology of Jesus, particularly the liberation theology, Christ in the liberation theology. Religion has been the interest of the high class, high caste, and the patriarchal interest. Faith in God is different from religion in the Asian context, which is very important to understand the hermeneutical flow of the dechristianizing the liberation theology. For example, the people's religion in the Asian context are numerous. It cannot be counted. This faith, the people's religions always talk about faith in God, that God doesn't have any system, any institution, any dogmas. These faith communities are the survival community, are suffering to survive. The people who are suffering due to various socioeconomic and political religious reasons. these communities wanted to have faith in God, but not to have any religious framework for their liberative engagements for themselves. So the oppressed communities of Asian context, their consciousness always worry about basically two things. One is how God should not be again the one more oppressive agency, and how much the ideology of God is not subjugating, it's liberative, in other words. These are the basic consciousness about the liberation or the freedom or the survival techniques or the coping mechanism of the suffering communities of Asian context. This is the general view about the Asian communities. So the hermeneutics of Dechristianizing the gospel for the Asian context or by the Asian people basically begin with two primary agendas. One is realization of the nirvana of the gospel. This is exactly like excoriating the Christology, the existing established Christology, through the lens of suffering and survival realities of the communities. And the second agenda is how to reclaim Jesus, the historical Asian person, historically West Asian person. Reclaiming the historical Asian Jesus itself is an act of decolonizing ecclesial Jesus. So in general, the dynamics of liberation engagement, which we have already been experiencing for centuries among the Asian communities, basically have two aspects. One is the religious aspect, in which we have liberation act of God, or the concept of incarnation of God or goddesses or deities in order to liberate the particular suffering community. These framework, liberation framework or liberative framework, we already have from various religious framework among the Asian religions. But the issue with those liberation framework is those liberation framework is exclusive. That is one of the aspect of the dynamics of liberation engagement already, which is existing in Asian context. The second aspect is, for example, the activists who are working towards the liberation of the particular suffering community, who are working with the people's movements, though they belong to particular religion, particular caste, particular cultural identities or the communities, they always keep aside all those identities and come together to work towards the liberation of the particular community or emancipation of the particular suffering community. Already the counter-liberation framework are there within the Asian culture, in the Asian history. So introducing Jesus as Christ, again, introducing Jesus as Christ, as a divine being, or one more deity, is something people consider it as a very immature framework, because already we are having or experiencing a common liberation framework where people of all the religion, people of all the caste, people of all the cultures can come together and work for the common cause by having a common liberation framework. So in that context, introducing Jesus as a divine is something is not very important or not needed. So Dechristianizing is an Asian demand hermeneutically. On the one hand, on the one hand, it is going back to the Jesus of the historical time, how Jesus was perceived as Christ. On the other hand, it's not about exclusively re-Asianizing or refashioning Jesus to Asian worldviews, but it is going back to the historical time of Jesus, where how Christology was understood by the suffering community, by the marginalized community. So these are the methodological consideration we need to take into consideration when we try to de-Christianize the liberation theology, which is the demand of the time for the Asian communities. If at all, if we think about liberation theology from the value of kingdom of God, which is all about liberation for all creations. Thank you.
First of all, I appreciate your careful critical of what liberation theology could not contribute to the Asian society at large. So your critique has led me to rethink the Minjung theology's contribution to the society in transforming social system which dominated and oppressed the people. So as you know, the Minjung theology is our Korean liberation theology. So this questioning could not get the answer now, so myself, but it impressed me to demand hermeneutical imagination of Minjung theology in the context of South Korea, like for the nowadays, like you argument of hermeneutical consideration in 3 points. I don't remember all the 3 points, but you say that. So in addition, I am glad to discover a point where in common with my perspective in terms of valuable our multi-religious cultural context in Asian Christianity. So when we say the Asia is too wide and broad, so as you know, South and Asian face the differences in religion and culture. For us, the East Asian Christianity adhered to Confucianism, Buddhism, Shamanism, and Taoism. And however, it is faced that we have lost valuable culture and knowledges to westernized Christian culture in Korea. So hence, I agree with your point of deconstructing the revelation theology from the colonial values. So like Jewish, Roman, British, you pointed. And then my understanding is that Christianization is uncovering the values coupled by colonial thoughts. So in this sense, do we need to de-Christianize liturgy and worship, even the church, or the church role of the church in the multi-religious Asian context? This is my question. So how can we de-Christianize the tradition liturgy, worship, and even the tradition's concept of church, so in our context? So I want to learn more about these questions from your perspective. So, and then second, and also the second question. The second question is, could you share the practical way of de-Christianization in your church, in your local church? It is going to be very helpful to develop liberation theology in our multi-religious cultures, I think.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the response. Two questions you asked. One is, do we need to de-Christianize our liturgy and worship methods? And second thing, can I offer some practical way of how we do de-Christianizing in our own context? To the first question, every theology has to be translated into the liturgy, because liturgy is the one is something which effectively deal with the communities, then the theology or the theological seminaries or the theological world or academia. So everything has to be translated into the language of liturgy. It is obvious for all the religions, by the way. But before something we make changes in the liturgy, that means we are dealing with the theology of that liturgy. Without dealing with the theology of that particular liturgy, we cannot go to the liturgical aspect. So my paper was all about how can we methodologically deal with the issues of the theological framework on liberation theology given by the Westerners, even the Asian methodological consideration demands to even have some kind of discontinuity from the liberation framework, what we feel or what we find in the gospel literature itself, canonical gospel literature itself. So there is a way to deal with the theology of a liturgy at first hand, then only we can move to the liturgy. We need to definitely move to the liturgy aspect. Second question is about, one of the example I can give you, when one of our pastor talk about the Samaritan woman narrative to the particular small, the village, uneducated, working class women. After narrating the story, he asked them, with whom you identified yourself? Then one of the women, she answered, I'm the one who is lying down on the floor. I'm wounded. I'm broken. My body is broken. My body is beaten up by the church, by the community, the men community. Always we want to, according to me, we need to deal with the methodology or the interpretation of the theology or the text, the biblical text, and the first level. Then only we can move to the practical aspect of it, because all the practices or practical aspect of the church always starts with the interpretation and the theological conviction. So one more example, only one second, I can tell you about why the Indian church is not able to get rid of the caste system within itself. That's the practical question we always ask to ourselves, because of the liberative framework which was given to us within the imperial ethos of the Western or the American framework, when they preach the gospel to the Asian countries, especially the Indian countries, Indian country. So there is a gap between the reality of the context and the theology, what we preach or what we interpret from the text. That gap has to be dealt with properly, systematically and hermeneutically. Then all the practical issues will be dealt automatically.